keeping up with our motto, let learning be a joy and teaching a pleasure. Here we are with a remote teaching and learning process to bridge the gap. Happy learning, students.
Hello, dear students. Today we are going to see the chapter from Science and Technology, Part 2. Chapter number 3, that is Life Processes in Living Organisms, Part 2. Students, we have already seen the first part of this topic, in which we have covered the parts like asexual reproduction in unicellular organism and asexual reproduction in multicellular organisms. In today's part, that is part 2, we are going to see the topics like sexual reproduction in case of plants, then pollination, fertilization, germination. Starting with the very first part, that is sexual reproduction in case of plants. Sexual reproduction is a reproduction where there is an involvement of male and the female gametes. Because without the union of male and female gametes, this reproduction is impossible. So in sexual reproduction, first of all, we will discuss about the male reproductive part and the female reproductive part. Then we will come to the fertilization, that is formation. So in plants, same way, first of all, we will start with the male reproductive part and the female reproductive part. But before starting with the reproductive parts, there are certain plants in which the flower is unisexual. Because in plants, the flowers are considered as the reproductive organ of that plant. So in some plants, the flowers are unisexual, that is, they contains only one gametes, either male gamete or female gametes. Whereas there are certain plants in which the flower is bisexual. It means that plant contains male gamete as well as female gamete. So in today's part, the sexual reproduction which we will be discussing, we are going to discuss about a plant which contains male gamete as well as female gamete. So here we have got a very common flower which is well known to everyone, that is hibiscus flower. The red color flower which we observe or we have used it for the pujas, that flower is a hibiscus flower which is a bisexual flower. Starting with the reproductive parts. The first part which we'll be discussing is carpel. Carpel, you can see it in the diagram. At the center, the green part which is been highlighted, that is called as carpel. Carpel is the female reproductive part of the flower, and it is present at the center of the flower, and it contains three parts, namely stigma, style, and ovary. Stigma, the first part. Stigma, it contains a sticky terminal part of the style. It has been made sticky. The reason behind is for it is used as a receptive organ on which the pollen grains germinates. That means the pollen grains will come and land over here. So since they should come and land over there, that particular part has been made sticky. The second part is called as style. Style is the rod like structure which we can see at the center, the elongated part which contains one or more ovules. At the bottom, you can see ovary, the bulging part. In that ovary, there are small seeds which has been shown. Those seeds are called as ovules. The swollen lower part of the carpel is called as ovary, which contains one or more ovules. And these ovules has an egg cells that is called as female gametes. So students, we have seen the female reproductive part of the plant that is called as carpel. And this carpel contains three parts. The three parts are stigma, style and ovary. Stigma is the topmost sticky substance, style is the elongated part, and ovary is the bulging part. This ovary contains ovules which are called as female gametes. So that is about the female reproductive part of the plant. Coming on to the next one, that is male reproductive part. The male reproductive part is called as stamen. This stamen consists of two parts, that is anther and filament. The stamen is the male reproductive part made up of two parts, that is anther and filament. You can see it in the diagram. Next to that green color part, the six small elongated parts which you can see surrounding it, those are called as stamen. The first part is called as anther. Anther is a bilobe and it produces pollen grains. These pollen grains are called as male gametes or male germ cells. Below anther, an elongated part is there called as filament. So this filament is the stalk of the anther. So that is about the male reproductive part of a flower. So male reproductive part is called as stamen. It contains two parts, that is anther and filament. Anther contains pollen grains which are called as male gametes and the filament is the stalk of the anther. So here we have seen the male reproductive part as well as the female reproductive part. Coming on to the next part, that is called as pollination. Now, we have seen the male reproductive part, we have seen the female reproductive part. For the fertilization to carry out, it is necessary that the pollen grains should come on the stigma or they should come and meet the ovules. So for this process is called as pollination. In this process, the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma and finally to the ovules. So this process of transfer of pollen grains is called as pollination. This pollination is of two types, self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now what is this self-pollination? What is this cross-pollination? You can see it in the diagram. In the self-pollination, you can see that the pollen grains are transferred from the same plant. Whereas in cross-pollination, the pollen grains are transferred to the different plants. Now, this pollen grains can be transferred because of various agents. The agent can be air, it can be water, it can be wind, it can be any insects, it can be birds, it can be animals. It's a natural process in which the pollen grain bags burst and the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma. If the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same plant and same species, it's called as self-pollination, as we have seen the diagram earlier. Whereas, if the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the another plant but of the same species, is called as cross-pollination. So, first part we have seen the male gametes and female gametes. In this part, we have seen the pollen grains, that is, the male gamete had transferred to the stigma. And this process of transfer of pollen grains to the stigma is called as pollination. If the pollen grains are transferred to the same plant of the same species, it is called self-pollination. Whereas if it is transferred to the another plant but of the same species, is called as cross-pollination. So till now the pollen grains has landed on the stigma. Here the pollination process is completed and comes the next process, that is called as fertilization. Here the pollen grains fertilize. Fertilization means the union of male and female gamete. Till the earlier part, we have seen the pollen grains has landed on the stigma. That is, the male gametes are waiting on the stigma. But for the fertilization, they should come down and combine with the ovules which is present inside the ovary. Because without that, the fertilization is impossible. So here, in fertilization, the pollination which has occurred earlier with the help of abiotic and biotic agents. Abiotic means agents related with the living things, and biotic is the agents related with the living things, and abiotic is the agents which is related with the non-living things. So as I said earlier, this pollination can be carried out because of various factors like air, water, wind, animal. So these things are categorized as biotic and abiotic. That is, living things are considered into biotic, non-living things are considered into abiotic. So after pollination, the pollen germinates, and when they fall upon such sticky stigma, the pollen tube carries two male gametes. So as soon as the pollen grains falls on the stigma, immediately a pollen tube is formed. The pollen tube is actually a tube which is useful for passing the pollen grains from the stigma to the ovary. At a time, only two pollen grains can enter through this tube. So one male gamete unites with the egg cell. That means from those two pollen grains, that means the two male gametes which enters, the one male gamete unites with the egg and it forms a zygote. This is called as fertilization. Students, remember that fertilization means the union of male and female gamete. So first male gamete has come, it has combined with the ovules, that is the egg cell, to form zygote. So fertilization is completed, first part. Now second male gamete, because as discussed earlier, two pollen grains are entering inside. Now the second male gametes unite with the two polar nuclei an endosperm is formed. And as two nuclear participates in this process, it is called as double fertilization. So there is a new term called as double fertilization. So double fertilization means the fertilization is carried out two times. The first egg, that is the male gametes, has combined with the egg, has occurred a fertilization. Now the second male gamete is combining with the two polar nucleus and it forms the endosperm, which is actually providing nourishment. So since the fertilization is carried out two times, this part is called as double fertilization. So this double fertilization results in the formation of a zygote, that is getting converted into a seed. After this, the last stage comes, which is called as germination. So in germination, the seed which is formed during the fertilization is used here. So the zygote which develops at the cost of food stored in the endosperm of the seed, and thus a new plantlet is formed. That is, the seed is sowed into the soil, and that is called as seed germination. So this is how the reproduction of a new plant begins from here. So in this part we have seen only the sexual reproduction in case of plants, where we have seen the male reproductive part of a plant, the female reproductive part of the plant, then the transfer of pollen grains, then the fertilization, and finally we have reached to the germination. So we have completed the sexual reproduction in case of plants. In the next video, we are going to see the sexual reproduction in case of human beings. Till then, thank you dear students.